makes their own decisions and everybody makes their own choices, but they're not the only ones that suffer the consequences.
Jill Duggar and her husband, Derrick Dillard, are ready to share their story. Their new book, Counting the Cost, promises to reveal the unedited truth about the Duggars.
For as long as I can remember, there was this sense of bewilderment with people looking at our family and just seeing all of us lined up in red dresses, out at wherever, and are they all yours?
Welcome down the rabbit hole, friends. Long time no see. It's only been a couple of days, but when you're reading a book like this, that can seem like an awful lot. And for me, I was frustrated that I got sick and my kids got sick, and it took us some time to get back into the swing of things. And I'm just glad to be back. We're going to move on with chapter 8. I'm going to go as far as my voice will let me go today, and I hope to get the rest of this book out to you within the next 2 days. So chapter 8 is called Pushed Aside. Before we get started with this chapter, I just want to go over a post that was put out, I think this morning or last night, by someone who's very well known in fundamentalist circles. Her name is Tia Leving. Tia was she was a mom who was raising her kids in the Quiverful movement and ended up leaving. She's done a really good job with her social media of speaking out against fundamentalist Christianity. She has brought up a lot of things from her past, things that happened to her and her children, and her social media on Instagram and on TikTok. If you have the ability, take the time to check it out. But here's the post she made this morning. It's regarding Jill Duggar's book, and I find it kind of interesting. I'm not sure if I understand everything about it, and I would love to hear some comments from you below about what you think in regards to this post. So Tia writes, I was struck that the response to Counting the Cost isn't Jimbob on the legal hot seat, or even TLC's witness of so much child exploitation. The response in 3 major outlets is about the status of Jill reconciling with Jimbob. And I just have to take some sips of hot tea while we do this. It's an expectation every survivor knows. It's all bass backward. What matters with abuse exposés is accountability and healing. Survivors don't owe their abusers forgiveness, holiday dinners, exposure to their children, explanations, or so-called reconciliation. I break down the Duggar statement in this post on the Anti-Fundamentalist. Link is in my bio. Remember, you can get a month free by sharing with your friends. Okay, so I think some popular news outlets have been asking the question, is there a reconciliation that will happen between Jill and her dad? What's going on with that? I think that's kind of the more salacious part of this story and the gossip that everybody often wants to know more about. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I see in Jill's book, because as I've put out there before, through this whole endeavor of going through her book, I do think that a lot of what Jill has to say in here, it's putting the truth out, the reality for all of us to know what has happened to her and what has happened to her husband, Derrick, through their interactions with Jimbob and TLC in the show. But it's also letting us know that there is some forgiveness on the other side of all of this. It's letting us know that her life with her parents, she has a lot of good memories about it, that the good can exist with the bad. And I really relate to that. Now, whether or not Jill makes up or reconciles with Jimbob really isn't the point of any of it for me. Even when I read you the epilogue, as beautiful as I felt it was, I don't think it's really necessarily about a reconciliation with her family. It's just more about living the way that it is, accepting things the way that they are, keeping up the boundaries that she's learned to create for herself, but also being strong enough and brave enough to still let some of these people in because she wants to, because she does still care about them. And that's part of what many of us have gone through in our lives. One of the biggest things about Jill's book, yes, it is about growing up in the IBLP, but I think it's so relatable for so many of us who didn't grow up in the IBLP. And I really like how Jill kind of, I think, recognizes that in certain ways, okay? Abuse that's been going on. Many of us have dealt with that in our own lives outside of the IBLP. And one thing that I really like about Jill's book is I think it's like very much recognizing that about the world, that the world itself isn't perfect, that all of us have grown up in very imperfect families. It's really rare that someone can say they just had an amazing childhood with amazing parents whose focus was solely on them at all times. But the level of issues that Jill dealt with, it certainly was heightened in many ways. But in my own experience, and I think in your own experience, from the many of you who have reached out to me and told me things about your past and your childhood, some of you in the IBLP, some of you in religious organizations, and some of you not at all. There are so many of us who have faced really hard times. There are people who have faced horrible abuse, both inside and outside of the IBLP. And I think that Jill, in her way of being like, I still love my parents, I still see the good times with my parents, she's kind of like acknowledging that there are worse circumstances out there to live in, okay? So I just find that, I find it like so relatable about her book, that it isn't just for people who grew up in the IBLP, because a lot of us have faced some of these issues. For Tia Leving's like post, what I'm hearing is that she doesn't really like the media focus on wanting to know what's going to happen with the Duggar family. And she wonders what the legal ramifications will be for someone like Jimbob Duggar. I do too. Because from my point of view, in the next chapter, chapter 8 and chapter 9, we see some potentially like illegal dealings by Jimbob Duggar, and Jill is putting it out on the table for us. So let's dive into this chapter. Okay, so chapter 8 starts with the death of a dream. I mean, truly, the dream that Jill and Derrick had to ever be able to go out on the missionary field and fulfill a life's purpose through that kind of work, it died at the beginning of this chapter. And for me, that's one of the biggest tragedies in this book. Jill and Derrick needed a simple piece of paper from TLC and from Jill's father, Jimbob, releasing them from any responsibilities in their contracts so that they could go live independently, away from the Duggars, away from the limelight, away from the money. They just wanted the piece of paper, and they didn't get it. And that is a huge tragedy, in my opinion. Jill writes, despite us asking Pops, Chad, and the network repeatedly, either for a release or at least a full copy of the contract itself, we still had nothing to show them other than the typed up bullet points which Chad had shared telling us the contract 5 years until June 2019, and the partial contract pages with Pops that didn't give us all the information that we needed. We'd lost the Panama job. And they'd kept us on their reserved list for as long as they could, but time had run out. You know, time really ran out on their dream. And that's horrific that Jimbob would do that to his daughter. All I can think is that leaving Derrick and Jill in this kind of a lurch pushes them towards potentially being more dependent upon Jimbob. Maybe that was the thought process. Or maybe it really was the evil thought process of like, I just want to get back at them. I just want to take them down a notch. They think they're so great. Well, I'm not going to help them get that contract. Let's see if they can do it on their own. And when their entire dream and world explodes, I'll just be sitting here on all this money, and they'll have to come to me and ask me for help. That's really over the top and sad. I can't even imagine. This is the death of their dream, what they wanted to do with their lives. One part of this story that I think is just really makes me question Jimbob's like mental health state is that Jill's very upset. She's kind of wondering what's going to be next for her and Derrick. And eventually she talks to her mom about how the job is gone and there's nothing they can do. And her dad finds out and he comes up to her and says, "You should have told me," he said. "I'm sure we could have worked something out." So this was about power, right? Like, why didn't you come to me? I could have fixed this for you. That's so sad for them. Yeah, definitely. Many people have accused Jimbob of narcissism, and I think I really see that in that whole interaction. And Jill writes, "I bit my lip so hard, I thought I might draw blood." Derrick said, "No, Pops, that's not the point. You aren't entitled to know what's going on in our lives. What would have been most helpful would have been to stick up for us with TLC, explain everything to them, and get us released from the contract." And then as another slap in the face, after this all goes down, Jimbob sends them a text with more information about the contract, and it turned out they had been told that the contract ended in 2019, but it actually ended in 2018. So he texts them and is like, "Oh, just so you know, I found out it ends in 2018, which would have meant they could have taken the job, but it's all down the tubes now." I mean, it's insanity. It's craziness the way that this went down. I also kind of, I think on their part, I really question, I understand that Derrick's "You're not entitled to know what's going on with us," but if I were in their shoes, I definitely would have been pushing and working with Jimbob. I would have been like, "What can you do? This is what's going on with us. What's the next step? Make it happen." I would have done what I could to get what I needed out of him. And I think they are so unmanipulative. They are so unwilling to try to get what they want out of someone. They always want to be righteous. That in some ways they helped the process along of Bob just being able to screw them over. And that's really sad for them, but I think once again it kind of speaks to the kind of people they are, almost righteous to a fault and honest to a fault. And for a while they thought about trying to work with the organization to see if they could go in another couple of years, because there were all these standards they would have to meet again. But they still felt they still didn't have a release form from TLC. They still were really unsure about what was really going on with the contract. They didn't have anything official. So Derrick went ahead and he sat for the tests that you have to take in order to get into law school. And he was accepted into a school, and I think they just decided that was the path that they were going to go ahead and follow. Meanwhile, the lawsuit that was going on in the background, it was dismissed against In Touch. And Jill writes about how it was hard to realize that she wasn't afforded much protection within the media, and it was hard. It was a hard pill to swallow for her. And this is where Jill, she quickly goes over the controversy about Derrick's comments on Twitter. We talked about this before, his comments about Jazz Jennings, as well as just some other comments he was making. He was tweeting at people saying they were wrong about Jimbob, or wrong about the show, or wrong about Derrick and Jill. And so she says that Derrick had been making comments on Twitter, speaking his mind about various topics and making a few enemies. It earned him a quiet conversation with Pops and a warning. "Be careful," he said. "If you've got problems, come to me." So once again, they're kind of living in a kingdom where Jimbob is sort of still the king of everything around him in that area of Arkansas. He's literally calling Derrick, and even though they don't have much of a relationship left at this point, and telling him "You better come to me. Stop making these comments on Twitter." I said before, and I'll say it again, I think that Derrick and Jill were really resentful and under a lot of pressure and unable to speak out in any kind of effective way, and that going to social media and speaking on topics there gave them a little bit more freedom, and that potentially led to Derrick saying and doing some things that now people really criticize him over, still to this day. Here Jill writes about just still feeling like she's sweeping a lot of things under the rug. You can see it here. Like, she's not happy. They've lost like their career fields. They've lost so many things because of this show and because of their dad's actions, that like she feels like she's not really, from what we see here, she's not confronting him. She really doesn't do a lot of like head-on confronting. And so we see she's kind of stuffing things down still. Even though they've gotten distance from Jimbob, they're still in a place of not being able to speak their minds in the way that a lot of us would be able to. And finally, Jill and Derrick decided that they were going to write a letter to Jimbob to talk about everything that had been going on and to get out some of the issues that they were concerned about. She said that it was 27 pages in total. But she says that the response from her dad was like, it didn't address any of the questions or issues that they brought up in the email. Instead, his response was short, and it said that he apologized for all the ways my actions and controlling spirit and lack of sensitivity and lack of communication have hurt you and Jill. He thanked us for bringing it to his attention, asked for prayer, and begged for our forgiveness, adding that he loved us very much. Kind of dancing around reality, right? Like these are, I'm guessing, now I don't see the email here for me to pick apart, but I'm guessing they're asking like concrete questions about what's going on with the contract. Like, what are we going to do going forward with this or that? We've had issues with this. They're asking questions and he's non-responsive. He's just saying, you got to pray for me. Give me some of that prayer. And then one day, just as summer began, Jill and Derrick come home to a letter from the IRS. This is when the shit starts hitting the fan. So Jill says like this would be a letter that would be easy for her to ignore. She's gotten letters like this before, and she usually just sends it on to her dad. In the past, she's just sent it on to her dad and his accountant to take care of it. How convenient, you know? Okay. So she says that ever since she could remember, her dad's accountant had always filed her taxes for her. But Derrick was like, no, I want to take some time to look over this letter and figure out what's going on. He immediately didn't like what he found, and he had been a forensic accountant at Walmart in the past. So he really got into the letter. And then he sat down with Jill to let her know that the letter basically stipulated that Jill owed taxes for a huge amount of money Jimbob had been claiming she made over the past several years. Jill writes that Derrick said, as far as I can tell, over the last 10 years, income from Mad Family Inc. that you've declared to the IRS is way higher than the $80,000 that Jimbob had given them. And she says, how much? And he says about $130,000 more. So if you guys remember, in a past chapter, Jimbob ended up giving each of the older kids $80,000. Most of them had to sign the TLC contract to get it, but Jill and Derrick didn't, and he still gave it to them. But now they're finding out that what he's been doing is declaring that they've been getting a lot more money on their tax returns. When they tried asking Jimbob about how he came up with the $80,000, or they just wanted more information about it, this was before they found out about the tax issues, he just went on and on about how, like, let me tell you about all the other kids. They're saving it. They're putting it, Jason, he bought a house and fixed it up. So Derrick, that's something you should get on. He's just like going on and on, like always talking in circles around like the real issue that Jill and Derrick are asking him about, and constantly like going on about how some other child is doing better than Jill and Derrick. And I think he really creates this competitive atmosphere among his kids of like who's loved and respected the most. Now this is interesting. According to Jill, she writes, Jimbob also said that he noticed within us a spirit of ungratefulness. It seemed clear to me that he didn't like us questioning his financial decisions. And Derrick continued to like question back and forth what was really going on with this $80,000. I guess the ending statement that Jimbob had with Derrick is he turned to Derrick and he said, "Derrick, what amount do you feel that you and Jill are owed?" And Jill writes, "It wasn't a question that invited an answer. It seemed like it was a challenge." So that was all when they received the $80,000 and they were trying to figure out how this had happened. You know, Derrick seems to have a very analytical mind, being an accountant. But Jimbob, $80,000 is a lot of money to me. Like, if I would have received that for being on this show, I think I would have been like, yay, amazing, I can put a down payment on a house. But also keep in mind that Jill and Derrick, they have a lot going on. They actually have a lot of medical bills that they had to pay off to the hospital for giving birth and having all these problems arise, and they didn't have insurance, and it was all featured on the show. So they were kind of like, you know, maybe $80,000 wasn't even what we think it is for them. So now they're finding out that there are all these tax problems, and Derrick and Jill are kind of like, what the, you know, they're wondering like what's been going on, what else has been going on behind the scenes with Jimbob, and what is he up to financially. And they decide that they haven't seen Michelle or Jimbob for a while. They're not attending some of the family functions that everybody attends in the family. So it's obvious that there's like a distance between Jill and her parents. And she decides she's going to see if her mom and dad want to meet with the mediator from the church that could maybe help them work out some of their issues. They arrived at the church for their meeting. And this is where Jill becomes kind of sad because Jimbob walks in and he has been outside watching this girl who kind of looks like a hippie, like just Jill kind of describes her as like a normal person like me, like wearing earrings, like maybe has some tattoos, is just dressed sort of different from anyone else in that church. And she ran into Jimbob and she was like, "Hey, you know, your show really changed my life and made me come to church." And so Jimbob asked her to say that while he videotaped her with his camera. I mean, talk about narcissism, talk about mental health issues. So he videotapes what she has to say, and then he brings it inside of the church. They're getting ready to meet for mediation. And he's like, wait, before we do that, look at this. And he shows the video to Jill and Derrick. And he says, "Isn't that great? She's so sweet." To me, this is full-on manipulation. I don't even know if he like paid that actress to show up and do this, because it's almost like saying to Jill, like, look at this stranger is nicer and more grateful to me than you are. She's better than you. I like her more than you. Check out this video I took of her right before we go into mediation. I really feel like that's what he's doing here. But he ties it up in a bow of like, oh, I'm just a sweet old Jimbob, you know, using my little flip phone to take a video. But Jill does say this was nothing new. Ever since he got a smartphone, Pops had been taking videos of anyone he'd met who complimented him on the show and how it had made a positive impact on their lives, and then he would share it in the group text that the whole family was involved in. Basically to say, like, look what we've done. Look at all these people who love us, but specifically me. Look what I did for you and our family. Wow. Now for Jill, this really brings up like just severe resentment in her, because she says, like, how can he look at this girl who's kind of like has tattoos, has piercings, has like sin or whatever, and be like, this is amazing, and then look at Jill who's doing all the things he told her she had to do, no tattoos, no piercings, no whatever, or I guess she had recently gotten the piercing, and be so negative towards her about everything. So she kind of talks about how resentful she is towards that. So they get into their meeting, and Jill has several points that she brings up. She kind of talks about how she says, like, wearing pants isn't sinful. I don't want to be treated like a piece of crap because of that. Of course, that wasn't her words. And she says, like, I just want to say I don't believe that Jimbob was disorganized or forgetful when he made me sign that contract and didn't really tell me what was going on. I think that that's just dishonest. She wants Jimbob to be transparent and give her and Derrick all the information about the contract. And then she says that her dad can make things right by paying the full amount that his accountant had reported on her tax returns. And she says here a total of $130,249. I guess the $80,000 is on top of that. But this is when Jimbob and Michelle, they start the meeting out just being very upset. Michelle responds about the letter. It was the most disrespectful thing I've ever read. And Jill says, her voice was soft, but her words hit me harder than anything she'd ever said to me. I knew she was right and that she was speaking the truth. I didn't exactly know how I'd messed up, but I knew that I'd hurt her and Pops, and that was never my intention. And even Derrick chimes in here and says, we never meant for things to be taken that way. Like, we really care about you guys. We love you. And she says that Jill basically writes that she wanted to go on with the meeting, but it seemed like Jimbob was just monopolizing it. He had a list of things he wanted to talk about. He was upset and said, are you going to apologize to me? He says, you sent a text message, Jill. You said I was verbally abusing you. I was so offended by that too. You know in your heart that's not right. Are you going to apologize for that? And he says, you're not going to apologize? Really? And this is where Jill kind of describes her father getting up and kind of standing over her. And she says that it wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. She felt it was an act of aggression. He towered over me, his whole body filled with anger, my face flushed red, my eyes filled with tears. So she feels like really intimidated in a situation where she was hoping this would be like a positive, mediated experience. And she says, Jimbob yells at her, you're guilty. And her mom starts crying. Derrick tries to speak, but Jill pulls him back. And Jill says, do you want to know why I'm crying? It's that you think I'm some kind of horrible person just because I wear pants and I have a nose ring, and yet you see that girl outside and you praise her. That's why I'm crying, Daddy. I'm evolving and changing just like that girl out there, but you can't see it. You treat me like a prodigal who's turned her back on you. You treat me worse than you treat my pedophile brother. And then everyone in the room seems stunned. She says that Jimbob doesn't even know what to say. And the moderator stands up and says, I think we need to take a break. Okay. So from Jill's point of view, her dad was getting like way too aggressive with her. Even physically, he was coming towards her. She felt very uncomfortable. She finally said some things that don't even seem like that crazy or off the wall or outlandish to me. And she's expressing herself and letting him know, like, this is unreasonable, the way that I've been treated for so long. And eventually the mediator, like, lets Jill know that I don't think this is going to work. This is not a situation that can be mediated. I actually think that both of you guys need to do your own individual kind of like therapy for a while first, and then maybe we can come back together and do some kind of mediated work together. The mediator literally said, you need professional help, which I'm so grateful for that. Like, I'm really grateful that this didn't turn into like the person there is like, this is what we're going to do. This is what the church thinks is the right thing to do. We'll set it out like this, and didn't even talk about doing therapy. This person did the right thing and said, like, you need to go get some professional therapy. Jimbob wasn't into it. He says going to a therapist is like just talking to a friend. Like, why don't you just have friends talk to you? And it wasn't in line with IVLP teachings, so he's not about that kind of shiznit. You know, he's not into it. But Jill and Derrick are like, yeah, we want to get some therapy. Now, Jimbob and Michelle do go to one session, but after that, who knows? She doesn't really seem to know exactly what they did. But she goes ahead and says that she and Derrick, they decide to attend therapy classes themselves. And she says that over time, it just became really clear to them that they were a long, long way from being able to resolve anything with their parents. They had a lot of things within themselves that they needed to work on first. Meanwhile, in the media, oh gosh, everyone was starting to notice that something was up between Jill, Derrick, and Jimbob and Michelle, and they were plastering it all over magazines and newspapers. Derrick's Twitter comments were an issue, but also they noticed that Jill and Derrick weren't attending like the family gatherings. Now Jimbob started coming to them and saying like, okay, when can we just talk and get this over with? When are we going to meet and resolve everything? And Jill says that to her credit, she and Derrick were like, look, we don't have a timeline for when we're going to start feeling better. We need to work on ourselves. We're taking time away from you, basically, is what they're saying. And Jimbob didn't really like that because he knew that it was becoming a thing within the tabloids and he was concerned about it. So he's aware. And even though he kind of caused all of these issues and he egged them on and he created all these problems in their life, it's like, oh, hell no. Now the media is starting to notice. let's tie this up with a big bow and make it a Christmas present. I don't want it to be too obvious to anyone that I screwed you guys over. In this part of the book, incredibly sadly, we learn that Derrick goes to apply for scholarships for law school because, once again, they don't have like a ton of money and they're dealing with whatever issues. I remember reading, I think it was in some kind of court proceeding, that Jill and Derrick talked about like going to food banks at times to get like cans of food and stuff like that because they were really living on love for a period of time when Derrick was in law school because he couldn't work that much. I think that's when he was being like a Grab driver on the side. And, you know, Jill, she was staying home with their 2 sons. So, I mean, they didn't have the kind of money that many of us perceived that they did. So he starts applying for all of these scholarships for law school, some of which he may have gotten, but something happened where he didn't meet the threshold for having low enough income because of the false income Jimbob was claiming Jill had made over the years. So this kind of brings it all up again. It's not even like, it's interesting to me because it's not even like, why can't Derrick and Jill just get over it? It's like it keeps causing problems in their lives. You know, they're just like, look, now we can't get these scholarships, so Derrick can like literally just do what he wants to. He's gonna have to work really hard in law school. Like this isn't going on a trip, you know, to Hawaii. He wants to go to law school and make a good life and a good career so he can take care of his wife and his family. And now he's being screwed over once again by something that Jimbob lied about. So they can't really let it go. They cannot move on, you know? It's just not even possible for them. So it was frustrating when they realized he couldn't qualify for these scholarships, but then I guess they had kind of been pushing Jimbob to go ahead and pay the rest of that $130,000. And they finally received an email back from Jimbob responding to their desire to get this money from him, okay? And I'm sure many of you have heard about this email or you've read it if you've gotten the book. Basically, the email said, here's a list of all the things I've paid for you your entire life and how much it cost. So here you go. I'll take a picture and put it up on the screen for you to look at, but it was stuff like apartment rent, because for 2 years, I guess, they lived in some kind of a place provided by Jimbob. 750 times 24 months is 18,000. Utilities discounted is 21,000. Midwife education, 5,000. HARP, 15,000. Furniture, 5,000. Cell phone for however long, 6,000. So he just lines up eating at home, $3 per day times 12 years, 13,000. All those tuna sandwiches. That's crazy. And then he writes, $129,940 is just the beginning of Jill's expenses made by Duggarfamily over the last several years. Most of this was made and spent on Jill before you two were married. Also taking into account many other ways we have spent money to help you. For example, installing air conditioning in your home in El Salvador, the stove and washing machine. Yeah, so he lines up this list, basically saying, like, I don't owe you this $130,000. And he says, essentially, we would be willing to write a check for $20,000 to you to settle all of this. And this is where it gets really sad. He says, Jill, When Mom and I pass on, you are set to receive 1/19 of everything we own that is set up in a trust for you kids. If you attack us, probably your inheritance will be lowered significantly. I love you, but I am grieved by the disrespect and the accusations that continue. So, basically letting her know like that inheritance is going away. Think about your kids, because now for me, I'm kind of like, you can't depend on that inheritance, Jill, not in any way, shape, or form. It's definitely a means of control, but look at all of the money that Jimbob is hemorrhaging towards his sons. I mean, really. It is Josh, all the legal fees, supporting him, taking care of his family, sending him to rehab, all of those things. That's a huge expense. But we've also seen like many of the other brothers have set up these huge companies where they have big machinery that they're using to excavate and build. And you better believe that a lot of that was funded and paid for by Jimbob. So it wouldn't surprise me if there isn't much money left over for some of these girls at the end. And of course he writes at the end of this email, "Love, Daddy Duggar." No, thank you. No, thank you, Jimbob. That's like really taking it a step too far. And I've said before, like, I think something really changed in Jimbob. In JB, things really changed for him. And maybe he had a lot of these issues always like boiling underneath the surface. But I do think that as time went on, maybe he even became very like highly paranoid or suspicious about people around him, started developing like a certain way of thinking. I know that as things in the United States became very like red versus blue, I think I saw a lot of changes in certain people, even around me. But it wouldn't surprise me if that also affected the Duggar family, where they have to like close in even more and become even more staunchly conservative and really defend everything about conservatism and believe that they're being attacked at all times. And the other side can say the same thing. Like they really hanker down in their beliefs. They're unwilling to be flexible and move it all towards the middle. And that was kind of like a cultural thing that was going on as well. And the Duggars already do it to an extreme. So there were a lot of changes that were happening with Jimbob, and in this letter, he sounds like a total jerk, clearly a narcissist, clearly believing he's the shit. It's shocking. It's really unfair. And in general, everything that I hear from Jill in here is that there's just a lot of humility in the way that she and Derrick approach Jimbob and her family the majority of the time, that they are kind of like, I'm sorry, like, we just want to know like how this works and how we can figure all of this out. I do understand that, the money they made from the show did go to things like putting Jill through a midwifery program. So I can kind of understand, but if Jimbob would have sat down with them and said, like, maybe I just really can't afford that. I mean, if he really couldn't have afforded, like, I cannot afford to give all 10 older kids $130,000. If that's really the case, then maybe you can sit down and talk to them about that, or maybe you could set up like a payment program with them. I don't know, but it seems like you're not even willing to listen, right? Because you're not even hearing that what's going on in the background is that Derrick's getting screwed out of everyday things that anyone else in the world would be able to have access to, like these scholarships. So for him, it's like he's not in a situation like a lot of the other kids where he's working for you and everything is being taken care of. So maybe the other 10 kids didn't need the $130,000 and maybe Jill and Derrick did. I don't know. But you could have sat down and listened and talked to them about what was going on in their lives in a non-controlling way, because clearly they're not willing to talk to you if it's just all about you controlling the situation. Okay, so then finally in the fall of 2014, Derrick and Jill, they hire a lawyer who sends an email to Jimbob saying, like, we formally want to receive the $130,000 you've declared on our taxes. Immediately, Jimbob starts calling them over and over again, and he has all of the other siblings start calling Jill. Jill says this ends up happening like on the eve right before, I think Derrick was going to sit for the bar. So they just ignored everything. They she said that she like texted her dad, like, we're too busy, we can't deal with this right now. And apparently Jimbob, or I don't know, she says that people texted back, so it may not have been Jimbob, it might have been like siblings. What? How come you won't talk? This is way more important than law school. Just the Duggar way, I guess. Jill says that she had a sibling come over to talk to her after everything was done with the bar. And the sibling said, Pops is telling everyone that if we don't stand against you both on this, we're standing against him. He said none of us can be neutral here and that this affects all of us. He says we might all be sued as a result of what you're doing. So he really drew a line in the sand. And yeah, this is the disintegration of a family that at one time, you know, they did show a lot of love for one another. They could have evolved their relationship in a positive way, even coming out of this kind of like cult-like atmosphere, and having had so many like terrible things happen over the past several years. There was still room for the siblings to evolve their relationships in a way where maybe they talk to each other more honestly about their feelings, you know. I mean, there could be positive things going on there, and Jimbob is stepping in and be like, that's never going to happen. We're keeping things exactly the way I want them, and Jill is the problem here. And you all better hop on board and ostracize her. And that's really sad, and Jill said that after the sibling left, she cried. She said it was one thing for Jimbob to be mad at them, but for all of her siblings to be angry, that was really hard. And her attorney, they talked to the attorney, and they said, like, you just have to stay calm and try to write it out. Like, eventually, you know, things will come to fruition, hopefully in a way where you can resolve a lot of these conflicts. And then all of a sudden, at the end of November, this is so weird, I really feel like Jimbob's sort of like in the mafia, or he thinks he's in a mafia, like the Duggar family is a mafia, and he's in charge of it, because he sends another sibling in the beginning of November to Derrick and Jill's house with a note, and the sibling says, here, they said, holding out a piece of paper, Pop says you've got 24 hours. The Duggar mafia. Oh my God, I need to make a video about that. That would be so funny. So basically, Pop still wanted to make a deal with, so basically Jimbob still wanted to try to make a deal with Derrick and Jill outside of the legal realm. And he said he wanted to pay them $20,000 that day. And they would sign an NDA saying that they would never talk about it. So they were just like, no, thank you. And their attorney went on to handle it. Now, poor Jill in the background, you'll have to get the book to really read over this. This is a great passage that I'm not going to discuss too much here. Once again, I want you to have some things that the book kind of, only through buying the book will you find out all of these little pieces of the puzzle that I think are really important. But I'm just going to let you know, she talks about like drowning in a frozen lake because she was just so full of fear and sadness. I don't even understand this. It was like really late at night. They were asleep. It must have been like the middle of the night. And they hear like a knock at the door, but they don't really answer. And they're like, what's going on? And then they look out the window and Jill sees her mom's car like driving away. Again, it's the mafia. Like Jill is also part of them. I mean, Michelle is also part of the mafia, I guess. And she was like, what's going on? Because it's never happened. Why is Michelle here in the middle of the night? And so they go out to see what was going on. But then they see that they got a text. I guess it's from Michelle saying, Jill and Derrick, we love you. I took the Discovery contract in its entirety to your house late last night. I apologize for going by so late. I left it in between your screen door and the front door. Love, Mom. So, I don't, like, what happened there? Is she the one that, like, stepped in and said, let's just give this to them? Or was Jimbob like, it's time. Michelle, take this. Put it in their screen door. Like, just so weird. The Duggar Mafia. Okay, so there were 30 pages of the contract. They looked over it. They had their attorney looking over it. And there was a part of the contract that talked about compensation. And it said that for each half-hour episode, Mad Family Inc. would be paid $50,000, and for a 1-hour episode, $65,000. And then eventually the numbers rose to 58 and 73. So over time, as the seasons went on, they got increasingly more money. And then there's a lot of information here about how Jimbob Duggar then decided how the money would be distributed on the taxes to different kids. And over the period of the time that the show ran, Mad Family Inc. was paid around $8 million. And Jill's wedding had netted an awful lot of money. She said at least $100,000. And Israel's birth had been a lot as well. And she says, when we'd asked him to cover our $10,000 deductible out-of-pocket expenses for the hospital, he'd pushed back and said that he couldn't do it. Meanwhile, she says that she watched Jimbob buy more and more properties and spend money on all kinds of things, and she was just coming to the realization that he had made so much money on the show and wasn't really using it in ways that she felt it should have been used. Like, for example, when she gave birth and they needed financial help. They're in talks with their attorney, trying to figure out what to do next, and all of a sudden another sibling calls them and says out of nowhere that Jimbob is willing to go ahead and pay the $130,000. That he didn't want to do it with an attorney, and he wanted them to sign an NDA. And again, Jill and Derrick say, no, thank you. We're not doing that anymore. They go through their attorney, and they finally get everything resolved. I think it was in January. So, they had only been working on it for a few months. But it looks like at the end of all of it, they had received a total of $175,000. Now, she does write that they had to pay lawyers' fees out of that money, which I personally know would be an awful lot. But I'm sure they still went home with a good chunk of money. And she said, we'd won, we'd gotten what we wanted, but I was never in the mood for celebrating. She felt like crap about it. She's drowning in a frozen lake over here. And she did feel like her parents and her siblings were acting like she and Derrick were just a bunch of greedy assholes. You know what I mean? And she's just like, we were just trying to get what was due to us. And once again, it's like nobody really understands. Again, because none of these kids have really lived outside of the Duggar bubble. They may not be understanding everything that Jill and Derrick are going through. For example, when Derrick just wants to go to law school and get some financial help, he can't get it because of what Jimbob did. Jimbob, didn't have to say that he paid them anything, and that would be a whole other issue, but he was putting on the tax returns that Jill got all this money. So, it was a sad time for Jill. Even though they got the money, she was very sad. That is the end of chapter 8, and I'm losing my voice. So let me edit this, send it out to you guys, and I will be working on chapter 9 later today so that we can get through this. Yeah, chapter 9 is the last chapter. Jill's book, Counting the Cost. I saw a interview with Jill and Derrick where they said they weren't opposed to reality TV, like being on a reality TV show. I was like, really? They said, we're opposed to not having control over how it's done. So I was like, maybe we will see some Duggar. I want to say, I like when stories continue on. Now, many people will say it's so hypocritical that they would go back to reality TV, but I like to see, I like to see what happens in these people's lives. So I would be there to watch it. I'm sure that they would be different about how they incorporate their kids. I've got a Christmas mug and a Halloween sweater. I am going to be doing another giveaway. I'm going to do a giveaway for a book again at some point, but I'm also going to do a giveaway for some very special earrings that have to do with sister wives. So look out for that. It will be coming up soon. Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you'll join me again when my voice comes back and we can head down another rabbit hole.